Hello, welcome back. My name is Dr. Christopher Gennari, and this is Great Big History. In episode 10, or our newly numbered episode 10, you may have noticed that I had two episode 5s, so I have to go back and fix everything. But in our episode 10, we're going to deal with assemblies and democracies. So when we start, we want to talk about war and geography. Determine the government in Greece. When we talk about Rome, we'll talk about a lesser extent the same thing. But war is how you end up with a republic or a democracy or an assembly. Because you have to rely on more and more people. And so war and geography determine the ideals of leadership and the form of government. So in Greece, you have this huge mountainous terrain, which means there's lots of poverty. There's not much land to grow food on. There's no money for chariots or professional mercenaries, the way wars are fought. And so you need farmers to fight. There's no room for giant battles, giant maneuvers like you have in a Egyptian chariot army or a Persian 250,000 imperial army battle. There's not enough space for all of that. In fact, the Persians are going to have trouble because they're going to invade Greece twice and lose both times because their army was built to fight in a big wide open space, and that just doesn't exist in Greece. The result of this is that the army is made up of farmers, and farmers are most likely to run away. And so the Greeks create the phalanx, Phalanx, which is untrained men standing shoulder to shoulder, carrying a spear and a shield that's on your arm instead of in your hand. And so it really protects the person next to you. And they're wearing head-to-toe bronze armor. Now, because their shield is on their left side and doesn't protect their right, doesn't protect the soldier who's holding the shield, doesn't protect half of them, you are literally protecting the person next to you, but you're also defenseless on your right side. And so what the phalanxes would do is fight in a place that has a mountain or a river or a creek, something that would protect their sides and their backs, because this square can only move in one direction, can only move forward. It cannot be a phalanx and turn around and back up. The result of the phalanx is that the rule of tyrannies, kings and tyrannies, ends and is replaced by oligarchs and assemblies. Since you have to rely on farmers to be your army, you either have to pay them or give them something, and there's no money to pay them. So what they end up doing is giving them rights. Those people are going to want to have a say, and that's our assembly. So since one person could no longer hire mercenaries, you don't have enough money to make an army for a private army for yourself as a leader, or rely solely on the nobility, which is the way chariot armies worked. People who joined the army wanted to have a say over their use of violence. If I am going into the army, I want to say when that army is going to be used. You have to ask me. You're not paying me, so you're going to have to ask me. Do I want to fight this war against these people? So assemblies had to meet to vote on big issues. So it starts with war, but it's going to be laws and taxes, because once they meet, they're like, hey, let's discuss other stuff. But they're farmers, and so they don't have the time to run government. They don't have the energy to deal with bureaucracy. Building canals, getting rid of the beaver dam, hiring people to build walls around olive groves. So the oligarchs are these rich men who run the day-to-day affairs of the government. In Sparta and Cyprus, they were still technically called kings, and that allowed them to also be generals, which is what they really wanted to be. By being a king, you were automatically the general. But what we have is guys with free time. They have enough money that they don't have to worry about the day-to-day events of their lives. So they can, since they're stable, they can do service to the state. And they'll be elected, they'll be reappointed by the assembly. The assembly's going to have to be okay with them, but for the most part, as long as they don't mess up, you get reelected. This is how our committees for faculty work. Once you become chair of the policies committee, you're pretty much chair of the policies committee until you don't want to be it anymore. Because every year we go for a vote and someone raises their hand and goes, the guy who did it before, you want to do it again? You did a pretty good job. So unless there's a major problem, once you become one of these day-to-day governmental leaders, the oligarchs, you pretty much stay there. And you get the respect that goes with it, and you get the access to power that goes with it. But remember, the assembly is always there to check your power. The oligarch is not better than the assembly. They're just doing the job that the assembly, the men in the assembly, don't have the time or the energy to do. So basically, you have a meeting once a month or once every couple months, and it's a summary. All right, the last 3 months, this is what's happened. This is what we think we should do. What do you think? And most assemblies go, okay, you do what you think is best. And that's how it works. So what does this mean for leadership? It means individual ability matters. You have to walk the walk. You have to lead by example. You have to fight in the phalanx. Spartan kings are going to fight in the most dangerous space, the front right. They're going to lead. They're going to lead by example. So, like Spartan kings, Spartan generals don't survive defeats. Now, the Spartans are very rarely defeated, but they don't survive defeats. They go down fighting. So you have to be able to walk the walk. People have to look at you and say, he does what he wants the rest of us to do. There is no being an oligarch. There's no being a leader in an assembly in Greece where you don't serve. You don't have a long resume of battles underneath you, of service to the state. You just don't, because no one would follow you. No one would elect you year after year after year. The second thing is you have to have good oration. You have to be able to speak to other people and get them to sit down, shut up, and listen, and then turn to each other and go, I like that. I'll follow that guy. So Odysseus in the Iliad is the one who can do so. He can bring all of these fighting heroes together. These heroes don't like each other. Agamemnon hates Achilles. Achilles hates Agamemnon. Ajax doesn't like Odysseus. The other Ajax doesn't like the other Ajax. Nobody likes each other because they're all individuals. They're all hotheads. They're all leaders. But Odysseus is able to bring them all together in one place to talk about, to make a plan. You need good oration. You need to be able to stand up in front of a couple of hundred people. 1, have them hear you. 2, have them shut up. 3, agree with you or be convinced by you. And then do what you're asking them to do. Command is not very effective. You can't force these people to do what they don't want to do. They're too important. There's too many of them. They're too individualized. There is no police force. There is no Nazi SS to force them, or Gestapo to force them to do what they don't want to do. So you have to persuade them. You have to have charisma. You have to have the ability to know what the followers want and then deliver for them. Because if you don't, you won't get reelected, or they won't do what you want them to do. So persuasion, negotiation, charisma all matter more than your ability to just yell orders. That gets you nowhere in a democratic Republican society. You have to persuade, negotiate, and charm. You have to convince. Vikings and Anglo-Saxon kings worked in a similar way. Viking kings and Anglo-Saxon kings are poor kings. They are not rich kings. They're not the king of France. They're not the Pope. So without the wealth to buy loyalty, they have to earn it. And then they have to keep it. Because anyone can get loyalty for a day. You've done it yourself. You've met someone, you've been charmed by them. They talk at a party, and you're like, yeah, you're nodding along. And then an hour later, you're like, that guy was full of BS. I can't believe I listened to that. I can't believe I nodded along. Like, you do this all the time, where someone earns your loyalty for 45 minutes, for a day. But then 2 days, 3 days later, they don't got it. So if you want to be a king, you have to be able to keep it. So how do you keep it? You help followers achieve their goals. But also, you have to balance the competing desires of different followers. Everyone wants to be the king's homeboy. Because if you're the king's homeboy, you're likely to get a lot of cool stuff from that. But if everyone wants to be that, if you pick one person to be your homeboy, that's going to upset the other people who don't get to be your homeboy. And upset the people who are depending on that guy to help you. We see this many times. We see this especially with female queens. Queen Elizabeth had to balance 2 or 3 different factions who did not like each other because the factions were led by an individual who wanted to be close to the queen. And they didn't want the others to be close to the queen. So these 2 or 3 guys also had followers under them who were whose loyalty was relying on them to get jobs, to get appointments, to get cool stuff by being close to the queen. We see this with Queen Christina in Sweden. Queen Christina really liked Magnus de la Guardia. But the Oxenstierna family hated the de la Guardia family. And the idea that she might marry and thus make king Magnus de la Guardia, who she had a huge crush on, was like verboten. It was beyond the pale for the Oxenstierners and all the people who relied on the Oxenstierna family to get them jobs. And that's where the king of my dissertation, Charles X, Gustav, comes in. He's a cousin. He's, not a direct, he's a cousin, right? But he's German. He's not part of this system. He's got the military pedigree he's been raised in Sweden during the 30 Years' War because when he was a child, his duchy got destroyed in the 30 Years' War. So he's been raised in Sweden. Everyone knows who he is. And the idea was, okay, she can't marry De La Guardia, who she kind of wants to marry. And the Oxenstierna is like, hey, you can marry us, but if she marries an Oxenstierna, she'll piss off the De La Guardias. So the basic deal, and they go to her, there's a moment in 1650 where they go to her and they say, you can marry Charles Gustav. That's who you can marry. And in 1650, she kind of plays for a couple of years with that idea, and she plays the different factions off against each other. And then in 1654, she's like, I'm going to just abdicate. I'm going to give up my power. I'm going to stop being queen. and Charles Gustav will become king. And everybody said, okay. It was weird. It was a shock. But everyone said, okay, if you're not going to get married, this is the next best thing. Okay. You could marry him. And she's like, I don't want to marry him. I don't want to marry my cousin. They had a good relationship, but, it was, if you're a queen and you get married, then everyone starts talking to your husband as if he matters. And that's the problem. So, like, if you're a married queen, you lose all your power. So why deal with the hassle? So she abdicated. In order to keep, one of the reasons, it's not the only reason, but one of the reasons was to keep the balance between the desires of different followers. Think of your boss. If there's not enough hours, but how do you keep your best workers? Your best workers want to make money. But what if the business isn't doing well enough? So you can't be open 24 hours. You're not making enough money. People won't come in. You'd be losing money to stay open like a Waffle House 24 hours a day. So, but how do you keep the best workers? You have to balance their desire for money and for promotion and for reputation and for dignity because they wanted to be treated well by their boss. You need to be balanced. But every hour you give to Sam is an hour Diane doesn't get. You've probably lived this. And how does it make you feel? Because you want money. You want a promotion. You want to be important. We see this with Ethelred the Unready, it's really not unready, it's unready, or in the Scandinavian, the unrod. It means unable to bring your counselors or lords to your assistance. The Råd is a group of counselors. It's the most important men of your realm. And so Ethelred becomes the unready because he was unable to get his lords to come to his assistance when the Vikings invaded and they lost England. They got kicked out to France. So he got this name of being the unready, which becomes the unready. But he wasn't unready. He just was unable to get the loyalty of his homeboys. He wasn't able to balance them off against each other. He wasn't able to keep them loyal. And so he lost his kingdom. In Greece, we're going back to ancient Greece, but this is true in England and in Scandinavia in the Viking Age. As cities got richer, government becomes bigger and more complicated. We'll see this with Rome. Same kind of thing. Leadership now becomes about balancing competing needs. Farmers and merchants, economics versus politics, colonial trade, declining families versus rising families. All of these issues. If you're a leader, you've got to balance all of these claims. The merchants want to do things that will hurt the farmers because it will help the merchants. We're seeing that currently in 2025. If you put tariffs on Chinese goods coming into the United States, that might help American merchants. That might help American workers in industries. But it's going to hurt American farmers when the Chinese who don't buy iPhones from America, they build the iPhones in China and send them to America. They're going to put a tariff on soybeans and corn and bacon. And so that hurts farmers. If you want to balance economics and politics, well, economics says that you should try to make as much money as possible. But politics, and then not really spend it. But politics says it's best to spend it. And maybe you don't want to make as much economics as possible. Maybe you want to put a tariff on somebody. Maybe you want to put an embargo on another city. Politics can get in the way of economics. And so you're trying to balance all of these things. But it also means that because the assembly voted, and they voted for the oligarchs, they voted for leaders. The oligarchs couldn't tell the assembly who was going to lead the assembly. That didn't work. Voting meant anyone with a good reputation and enough money had a chance at leadership. They could, buy friends. They could buy votes. And in the ancient world, there's nothing wrong with that. You could go because you were helping people. You're not buying their vote per se, but you're helping pay their mortgage. And then you're like, oh, you know what? I'm running for leader. I'm running for one of 5 leaders. Could you, are you going to vote? And they can say, of course I'm going to vote. You just helped me pay off my mortgage. Things like that. Oh, you helped me get seeds for my farm. So we'll see this, if you take American history courses, you'll see this in Tammany Hall, that the political parties in America spent money helping people. In exchange, those people voted for the political parties. So voting, the fact that you had the assembly and it voted for its own leaders, meant that anyone with a good reputation that people liked could be the leader, could become one of the leaders. Remember, there's no one leader. There's a couple, because they're not leading the assembly. They're running the day-to-day business of government. One person can't do that. Even kings have a lot of power, and we'll talk about that when we hit divine right. They have people underneath them who are doing all this stuff. The president has his cabinet, and underneath the cabinet are all the different departments. But increasingly, the assembly demanded more of a say on important issues. As their citizens get wealthier, as the city gets wealthier, as government gets more complicated, people increasingly want more and more and more of a say. It's their money. So how do we get a democracy? We get a democracy with navies. And in fact, you'll notice that it may not be causation, it may just be correlation. But if you think about the great democratic societies, they all have big navies. Now, it's not a one-to-one, but the United States, Britain, Athens, Rome, they all have big navies. Navies are rare because they're expensive. So you need rich people to either donate money or pay taxes in order to build a lot of ships. Ships are expensive. An aircraft carrier is expensive. I don't know how many tens of billions it costs to build today, but it's expensive. There are no cheap aircraft carriers. There never have been. Plus, in Greece especially, but this is going to be true in other places, they require huge amounts of manpower. Even Spanish galleons might have hundreds of men on them. The trireme, Trireme, which means 3 levels of oars, 3 rows. The trireme required 200 people to row. And it had a ram at its front. It fought like a phalanx at sea. So why does this matter? Well, Athens, which had the largest navy, had 300 ships. Well, 300 ships times 200 men per ship equals 60,000 rowers. 60,000 people rowed. Why does that matter? Because these guys are rowing 4, 5, 8 hours a day for months at a time, protecting the sea lanes, protecting the state, moving commerce. So these guys are ripped. They're in shape. They're young men. in 25 to 40 years of age. They have money because they can't work. They have to be paid by the state. Again, so either a rich person has to donate the money, which they'll do. You might think that's crazy, but of course rich people donate the money. They get to put their name on the boat. People go, oh, that's Mr. Sebastian's boat. Isn't it nice? Isn't it beautiful? Oh, Mr. Sebastian's paying the wages for that crew. Those people are going to like Mr. Sebastian because it's now money in their pocket. So they have money in their pocket because they're rowing. They don't have time to spend it. So they have confidence. If you are ripped and in shape and have money in your pocket, you've got confidence. You've got swagger. And we see this in history where people talk about an Athenian walk. It's a democratic walk. The Brits will talk about Americans as they walk down the street. They have a way of just of confidence because they're a citizen. They know they're important. Well, that gets us a democracy. Ripped young men, tens of thousands of them, with money and confidence. They don't want to listen to the oligarchs. They want to have a say. And since anyone can row, that means the poor people are going to want to have a say. And so what happens is the assembly runs itself. The assembly becomes sovereign. It's like a class choosing its own tests, choosing its own teacher, choosing the questions on the test. And I do this, whenever I do this in class, I talk about this, and the students always laugh. And I go, you're not a democracy. No matter how much we talk about America's a democracy, we're not, because we don't think of ourselves that way. We don't think a class can choose its own teacher because you've never had a class where you've chosen your own teacher. But that's what now the assembly does. Instead of the assembly choosing from a bunch of rich guys who will be General 1 and General 2, instead the assembly gets together and they debate it. It's now bigger than it was before. Instead of a couple hundred men, it's a couple thousand people. And what happens is they debate and they go, hey, I want Joe. Joe could be the leader. And someone else says, hey, that's a great idea. I like Joe too. Joe, do you want to be the leader? And Joe's like, I guess. And like, Joe. And they vote for Joe. Right? They choose their own. And the rich don't reject this. Or in these certain places that have democracies, they don't. Now, later on, they will. During the Peloponnesian War, there's all of these fights between the poor and the rich over who's going to run the show. But in a place that has a place that has a big navy, the democracy wins because the poor rowers are too important. The rich people know they can't. They'll get rich. If the Navy is out there moving goods around, protecting the sea lanes, protecting from pirates, they'll get richer. So they're willing to pay short-term for a long-term gain. So a democracy is an assembly, but huge. And it's much more emotional. And that's good and bad. It could be moved to do good things, but also to do awful things. We see this in the Peloponnesian War. Actually, we see the first example in Herodotus, when the Ionian Greeks revolt against Persia. They come to Sparta, and they say, we're the Ionian Greeks, protect us. The Persians are going to come, and they're going to conquer us, and they're going to put us back into Persian slavery. And the Spartans go, how big is this Persian army? And they're like, 250,000 people. And they're like, yeah, you're insane. This is an insane idea. Guys, you revolted, you're in trouble. And then those guys go to Athens, which is a democracy. Sparta's not. Sparta had the oligarchy. They had a king. Then they had the assembly. But the democracy says, let's hear what they have to say. And they say, oh, we're enslaved and we're fighting for our freedom, liberty, freedom. And the Athenians go, what do you want us to do? And they say, send some ships and some men and help us defeat the Persians. And the Athenians say, yes, we will do that. We'll send 20 ships. We'll send 10,000 troops. We will help you. And that emotional reaction. They shouldn't have done it. It's a good thing that they did, but they shouldn't have done it. And the Spartans are right. It makes no sense. The Ionians are going to get reconquered. And they are. They get reconquered. And that starts the Persian Wars, where Persia is going to invade Greece, partly to punish the Athenians for getting involved in the first place. They will also be convinced to do awful things. Again, the Athenian democracy will choose to commit a genocide against the Milesians, against Milos. They'll have a debate. It takes 3 days. And in the end, they voted to murder all of the men of Milos and sell the children and the women into slavery. They voted to murder Socrates for being traitor to the values of Athens. Something Plato never forgave democracy for. So it can be moved because it's emotional. Because the speakers can play on the emotions of the crowd. You see musicians and you see stand-up comics do this all the time. This is why you want to be a stand-up comic. Because if you're really good at it, politicians as well, if you're really good at it, you can get the crowd to be, as we call it, on your side. They're with you. They're nodding along. They're seeing your point of view. They're hooting where you want them to hoot. They're hollering where you want them to holler. And it's a cool feeling. Any teacher, remember, teachers are performers. They stand up in front of a group and then try to lead that group. They'll talk about it in performance terms. The crowd was with me. The students were with me. We were doing some cool stuff. This is also subject to populare and demagogues, charismatic leaders who can use and exploit the emotional desires of the people. There will be people who get up and go, "Don't you all want a tax cut?" And people say, "Yes, I want a tax cut." "How about you pay no taxes?" And people say, "Oh, I love that idea. I don't want to pay any taxes." Now, you have to pay taxes because otherwise the snow won't be removed. The sewers won't work. There'll be no army. There'll be no navy. But you could get a demagogue. You could get a populare. You could get this leader who knows how to play on the emotions of the crowd for either selfish or emotional negative things. So now, in a democracy, leaders have to care about new groups. The poor now matter. Elite conservatives matter because elite conservatives don't like the democracy very much. Even in Athens, they abide it. They're okay with it, but they don't like it very much because they used to run the show. Now they have to placate these poor people. Rowers are always going to vote for a large navy. So the moment you get up in the democracy and you say, "I want to cut the navy," you're done. We see this today with American leaders, presidents. Nobody ever says they want to cut Social Security or Medicare. Too many people rely on it. Old people are always, always, always going to vote to protect the things they get. Social Security and Medicare. Merchants are going to want a large navy, but they're also going to want low taxes. Suppliers are going to want a large navy, but they're going to want a different kind of use of that navy. And so you have to play off. You need loyalty of large groups. Now, that can be rock solid. Pericles is going to be leader of Athens for 30 years. But the people after him are like one every couple of years, one a year, one every 2 years. They go very quickly because they don't have the support. George W. Bush won a resounding win in 2004. But after Katrina and then the start of the Great Recession, Republicans, the entire party lost all of its support and could barely get elected in 2008. So because the democracy is very emotional, you have to play on their wants. You have to play on their needs. You have to play on their desires. You have to constantly negotiate these things in order to lead them. And when they support you, you're FDR, you're Franklin Delano Roosevelt. You're in power. You're re-elected year after year after year. You're Pericles. But the moment you're not, you're done. Because the emotion can turn against you very, very quickly. So Thucydides and leadership during the Peloponnesian War. Thucydides is the great military historian of the Peloponnesian War, and he talks about leadership. And he loves Pericles. He holds Pericles up as this like great, perfect leader of a democracy. And for Thucydides, the goodness of a leader was that Pericles did what was good for Athens, even if it wasn't good for himself, even if it wasn't good for Pericles himself. This is one of the great quotes. And it's very simple. I'm a rich guy, but I'm gonna raise taxes on rich people. That's gonna hurt me, but it's good for Athens. Pericles did what was good for Athens, even if it wasn't good for Pericles himself. The successors, Pericles will die of the Athenian plague in the third year of the war. The successors, on the other hand, promised success for Athens, but the success was mostly given to individuals. So they conquered a city, and who got most of the money? The successor, the new leader. They'll give 10% to the people, but 90% went into their pockets and their homeboys' pockets. This is how Putin works. This is how Orban in Hungary works. Whatever's exploited, they promise, the people will succeed. This is how the USSR worked, the Soviet Union. The people will succeed, and the people will get better. And they got better by 4 or 5%. But the elites got better by 80 or 90%. But when the successors failed, like in Sicily, everybody suffered. So what Bernie Sanders said in 2007 and 8, that the big banks want the rewards to be privatized. They want capitalism for their rewards, but they want their failures to be socialized. They want the big banks want everyone to suffer and everyone have to pay for the mistakes of the bank. But when the bank makes money, it wants to keep most, if not all, of that reward. And so we see this idea of Thucydides and leadership today, right now. Thucydides saw the role of leadership as controlling people's passions, their greed, their violence. Thucydides, Plato, Aristotle, not big on people. They don't think people are angels. But Thucydides also presented leadership as control over oneself. Know thyself, which is written in stone over the Delphic oracle. Know thyself. Thus leading people instead of being led. You tell the people not what they want to hear, but what they need to hear, which is not easy to do. Believe me, I don't like doing it. You have to do this to students all the time. The student will come and say, I don't like my D, and I have to tell them, your paper is a D. It's not a good paper. It's way easier if I just give you a B plus and move on. Then you don't complain. But it's my job to tell you what you need, that you're mailed it in. You're not doing a good job. But the successors, Pericles could do that, but the successors were less confident. They were more selfish, and they used popularity for themselves. They liked being popular, and they liked getting rich. But they weren't Democrats. They didn't care about the thing called democracy, big D. They used the popularity for themselves. In Aristotle's politics, morality matters because systems can decay from a good form into a corrupted form. So there's three good forms of government. Monarchy, ruled by one. Aristocracy, ruled by, it could be the best, but it could also be the few. And democracy, ruled by the many. Now, Aristotle thinks the monarchy is the best form because it's the least selfish, which is kind of the opposite of how Americans would feel. But if you're the king, you own everything, so you want everything to succeed because if it succeeds, it will help you. So that's kind of the King Arthur version of kingship. That since the land is tied to you and you are tied to the land, and this is kind of how the mandate of heaven works, you want everyone to succeed because if they succeed, you succeed. And so the more people you have, the more fingers, the chefs you have in the kitchen, the less efficient government is. That's the way Aristotle thought about it. Because he, again, doesn't really trust people. He likes them more than Plato does, but not big on people. He's like, people are lazy. People are selfish. People do bad things because it's easy. Every time I walk into a Wawa, I say, I am not getting chocolate. And then what happens? I'm getting chocolate. Is it good for me? No. I shouldn't have the sugar. I shouldn't have the chocolate. But is it delicious? Yes. And should I have kept those $2 for the king size bar? Yes. But I didn't. See? Even I don't live up to the purest form. So monarchies can decay into tyrannies. The rule for one. Instead of by one, it's for one. That the difference between the king and a tyrant is a tyrant rules for himself to make himself rich. The oligarchy is rule for the few instead of by the few, which is aristocracy. And then democracy, rule by the many, becomes a mob. What anarchists would call anarchy. The mob rule, the everyone for themselves. Now the anarchists will say, no, we're Rousseauian, that the mob can rule itself. It's only conservatives that say the mob, that people can't figure out their own things. And maybe they're right. We have communes. We have very localized form of democracy. We have PTAs. We have non-constitutional forms of government that people, you and your friends have, a democracy, but it has no rules. It has no constitution. So it's kind of mob rule when you want to decide where to go out to eat or how to spend a Saturday night. So all of these things are on gradients. All of them are on spectrums. But for Aristotle, the Greek philosopher Aristotle, selfishness had to be contained. Competition had to be managed. Emotions and desires needed to be meditated or mediated, I should say. Moderation in all things, as Aristotle puts it. No one could get everything they wanted. But the more people involved, the more likely the system was going to fail because the more people you had to rely on to not be selfish. To not be out for themselves. And so, if you are democratic or leader, if you're a leader of an assembly, your leadership is constantly balancing. You have to be charismatic, but you have to be aware. You have to have information. You have to know what your people want. You have to know how to get it to them. They might want dignity. They might want reputation. They might want promotion. They might want more money. When you're, like me, a member of the negotiations committee for a union, you have to balance what all those different group people want. New mothers may not care about more money, but they want more maternity and paternity leave. They want more time, right? But the people you're negotiating with of the school want you to be at work more. They don't want to pay for you not to be at work, even if you have had a new baby. They don't care. because they have to pay somebody else to do the job you're not capable of doing because you're on maternity leave, which to them is an economic negative, even if it's a social benefit. Other people may care. They say, I've had my kids. I need money. I'm getting ready for retirement. So you're constantly battling these different groups. You're constantly negotiating. So you have to be charismatic. You have to be emotive. You have to connect with these people on an emotional level. Assemblies and democracies are emotional. They're not logical. So appealing to their logic doesn't work because they care about their emotions. Groups care about their emotions. So as groups get bigger and richer and more inclusive, the requirements of the leader changes. Greeks needed citizens to be soldiers, so you needed to give them a say. Leadership meant negotiating, as I just talked about, with the desires, but also limiting their demands. You get people who I want a 20% raise, and you have to be able to tell them, but in a way that will keep them on your side. You're never going to get a 20% raise. It's not going to happen. We got 2% last year. We're not getting 20% this year. There's no money for 20%. But you have to do it in a way that doesn't make them mad, that doesn't lose their loyalty. So you have to negotiate their desires, but also limit their demands. Good leadership could balance the needs of the many against the needs of the few or the one. So everything, a democratic leader is always in tension, which is maybe one reason why presidents always age. Like, look at Obama. He was president for 8 years. He looks like he aged 20. You say, well, that's because of the decision-making and the stress. It's like, most days aren't that hard. Most days don't have giant, like, do I nuke Iran kind of questions. But you're constantly on. You're constantly working. You're constantly negotiating. Who do I have to call now? Who do I have to ask for money? Whose vote do I need? What do they want? It's that. You're constantly negotiating. And you could never say, shut up. Just do what I say. You never have control over a group. You have to persuade them. So Greek success shows that groups have power. The Greeks are different from the Persians with one person in charge and his family running the show, or the Egyptians, the warrior kings, or the executives. The Greek success shows that groups can have power, that they can be motivated to act in great but also terrible genocidal ways, that monarchies, you are owed a loyalty. And entrepreneurs, you can buy it. Entrepreneurs have the money to buy loyalty. My boss buys my loyalty by paying me more. But if someone else will pay me, I'll leave my boss and go somewhere else. But Greek success shows that there is a level of motivation. There's a level of loyalty that monarchies and entrepreneurs can't access. That by involving people in the decision-making, by giving them part ownership in the success and or the failure, you can unlock a level of motivation that other forms can't. All right. Thank you. Be safe. Talk to you soon.